next slot then is me talking about the HDS Bold scale and just trying to dig into it a bit more to see if we can get a bit more meat on the bone, see if we can add a bit more vocabulary for you for when you're feeding back on the Bold scale. And in terms of, why did we pick Bold this time around? So we've previously done, I started off with leisurely, which of course is a really complex one. And then I did mischievous. With Bold, I think this was what somebody asked for at the last session. So we've gone with that. I think the thing with Bold then is it's not as difficult to understand. Like leisurely and mischievous, I think, have quite a few different aspects to them. But it can be difficult to feed back. And I think maybe that's why this was suggested as one to spend a bit more time on. It can be very difficult to convey the downsides of scoring high on Bold to a person who is high on Bold, and in a way that they might actually acknowledge and respond to positively and productively and start doing some work on. So I think when I think about Bold, and I was just did an exercise for myself and thought, well, what are the things that for me spring to mind about somebody who's high on the Bold scale? And these were the three things. I know it's not 3 words, but these were 3 sort of characteristics that I think of. So yes, there's the confidence piece, that overconfidence, that total self-belief in one's own abilities, unquestioning, unwavering entitlement. But also that sort of all about me, trying to turn any event, any situation, anything that you might be discussing into an opportunity to present themselves in a positive light, or even turning things that might seem negative into something positive, so you still view them positively. But then there's this final piece, and this actually comes from work that I did with a particular person. But I have seen it also play out in other people, is this optimism. So this is the real upside. Yes, you've got that confidence, but you've got this optimism. People who are high on Bold really assume that things can be done and think things will happen and things can be achieved. And that can be a hugely positive characteristic to have. Again, another issue in trying to sort of tap into something where the Bold person will start, the scales will start to fall from their eyes and they'll start to see, well, what might be some of the downsides of this? Because, that obviously is a huge positive. And what about the name? We talked with leisurely and mischievous about the names. For us, of course, leisurely is a huge problem because it's not a word we use in the UK. Mischievous has a little sort of impish quality to it, which may be in an executive situation, might not always be so easy. But Bold, I think, is probably fairly straightforward, unless anybody here has had any negative experiences of feeding back on Bold. But again, that's pretty positive, Bold. It sounds like it's something that's going to be associated with somebody who's going to achieve, who is going to rise, who's going to be prominent in any situation. And in terms of other names, and one name that I'll reference, and it doesn't add anything to the table, Alderman Morris, who I've referenced in my previous talks on this, and who look at the normal style of a personality disorder. So for them, they just call it the self-confidence style when it's in the normal range. So again, it's all pretty positive. So in terms of what's our starting position, one of the things you all know, you're all very familiar with this stuff. How do we actually define the HDS, both in Hogan certification workshops, in manuals, and in reports? So the general description is, of course, that the Bold scale reflects the degree to which a person has inflated views of their competence and worth. So tapping into what's, so inflated, overestimation of what they actually can do, with the result then that they seem unable or reluctant to admit to mistakes or take any responsibility for things that have gone wrong, and therefore don't learn from experience. And in terms of what makes them hard to work with is that it just tips over into, then they feel they can demand anything and everything, and they're entitled to everything. Yes, they should have that promotion. Yes, they should be leading that group. Yes, they've got an answer to that question. Yes, their opinion is great and should be listened to. But at their best, they've got that optimism, they've got that confidence and energy and dynamism to get things done, if they can get through and work through setbacks. So where can we look to in terms of digging a bit deeper? Are there any other sources of information we can look to see if we can add any other layers to the BOLD scale? And as I've done before, I have looked at the personality disorder literature because, as you know, the HDS taxonomy, while the HDS does not, and I always say this, absolutely does not measure personality disorders, the taxonomy does relate to the personality disorder framework. It's not absolutely congruent, but it does relate to that. And if we're talking in personality disorder terms, then the HDS Bold scale relates to the narcissistic personality disorder. So if we start to look at the literature around that, around narcissism, does that start to open up any more descriptors? And if we start with the extreme, so with the personality disorder actual definition, does this tell us anything? So in terms of actually being defined as having the personality disorder of narcissism, you have to display this very consistent pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy, which was interesting to me because I hadn't thought of it like that before, and a heightened sense of self-importance by 5 or more of the following. So yeah, the grandiose sense of self-importance, exaggerating your achievements and talents, expecting to be recognized as superior, even if there's no actual evidence that you are. Preoccupation with fantasies of success, power, beauty, and idealization. And you see, later on we have some quotes from people who are high on BOLD. They don't have the personality disorder, they're high on BOLD, but some of these themes come up in terms of how people describe themselves. Belief in being special. And this sort of notion that, well, they should only really associate with other special or high status people to be truly understood or appreciated. So that kind of added a little extra for me. Demanding excessive admiration. I think we probably know that one already. But it's a different way of saying the same thing. Sense of entitlement, obviously, that's straightforward. Exploitation behaviours. I've put that in green because I tend to associate that more with mischievous, so the antisocial. Personality disorder, but I guess when you get to the disorder level, you're talking about somebody who's so extreme in their own views, and they're not worried about hurting people along the way to get what they want. And lack of empathy, again, just really sort of that's the impact in the end, is that it's just disregarding what other people want to say or taking on board their opinions, and not recognizing that you're going to hurt people's feelings if you keep ignoring them. But also this jealousy piece as well, which was perhaps another piece that I had. And this also comes up in the quotes of people self-describing. Envy towards others, or a belief that others are envious of them. So, and arrogant, haughty behaviours and attitudes. Well, we know that one. So there's a lot here that, yes, it is describing the disorder. So some of the language might seem a bit extreme. Some of it simply kind of echoes what we already know, but some of it adds another little flavour, another nuance, I would say, to our understanding of this construct, of this characteristic and how it appears in real life. So are there any additional useful descriptors that we find when we look at the people who write about personality disorders, but the normal range of personality disorders? And those are the same people that I've referenced before, Theodore Millon and Oldham and Morris. And so I have to confess, actually, this description is from the personality disorder, it's not from the normal style, but the language is just, for me, delightful. I just love it. And so this is Theodore Millon. I love this, they are self-proclaimed shining stars. We are expected to watch and admire. For them, the rest of us are simply worker bees. And for me, that was like, you just planted this. If you're into visual imagery, if you remember things visually, that is immediately something that I can capture, that I can think of when I'm imagining somebody who's high on BOLD. And that we're worthy only of taking and carrying out their every direction. But we're not worthy of having an original thought. Of course, I'm talking as if none of you are BOLD, but probably some of you are. And so I just love that description. And then there's a point here that is very much something that we come up against when we're feeding back to people who are high on bold, because they will find all kinds of ways to justify what they do, to excuse what they do, to say, but I do that because. So, you know, they do try to always put themselves in the best possible light. So a little bit more language there. And then when Millon writes about the normal style of this, then talks about the more adaptive characteristics of the narcissism in the normal range style, he describes an asserting pattern. And again, the language here is very congruent with the language that we already have of bold. But you know, he starts off his description by saying society often values narcissistic traits. So again, echoing this problem that we face in trying to work with people who are high and bold and really understand the negative impact they have. And lots of words there that we would use, again, positives about, they're naturally good at being a leader. They naturally can assume that role. And just words like being ambitious, decisive, having self-regard, entitlement, and feeling special. So those echo the themes quite a lot. Then Alderman Morris, they have described, as I said, they call it the self-confidence style, but the normal range narcissism. And they have 8 characteristics that they use to describe these people. And there are some things, some words and phrases here that I think add a bit and that you might want to use sometimes when you're interpreting somebody who's high on bold. So yes, we have self-regard. We've seen that many times. But the red carpet, I thought that was a really nice way of describing how they expect to be treated. Again, it's something that you can immediately kind of visualize and lodge in your memory. The ambition, yes. Politics, perhaps we don't say too much about politics for people who are high on bold, and you would want to look at things like their ambition and also things like how team-oriented or not they are. If they're more the self-serving type and they're high on bold, then the politics, I think, will very much come into play. And they're very, they don't have an issue, they don't feel uncomfortable dealing with the politics of an organisation in terms of getting to where they want to be. Competition, yes, we know that they are hugely competitive and they thrive on that. But this stature piece, which actually I mentioned just briefly before, yes, wanting to associate with and identify with others that they deem to have high rank and status is something that's important to them. Dreams, I guess this isn't something I'd thought of either, but they are, and I do think this can happen with people who are high on bold. They're able to visualize themselves as the hero. They are the Superman or the Wonder Woman. They are the best in their role or the most accomplished. And poise. So I thought that's not a word I personally have ever used before in relation to somebody who's high on bold, but I think you could see, I talk about people being socially skilled or, having a presence or being unflustered, but poise, I think, is a nice word to use in relation to people who are high on bold, because not only can they sort of deal with setbacks, but they can also, they love a compliment, and they'll take it with poise and equanimity. So what about then at work? How do these characteristics, these feelings, these beliefs that people who are high on bold then manifest at work, and what are the upsides and the downsides for them and for us? What are the problems that they cause? So these are also from the Alderman Morris book, and we start off with things that are positive, and then we start to move into areas that are not so. So that optimism, energy, competitiveness, they're able to make decisions, to set priorities, goals, to delegate. This all feeds into the positive aspect of being high on bold. Maybe they can be, they've got that energy, drive, belief in their success and the success of the organisation. So if you're needing to impress, if you're needing to deliver a new product, or you've got a new startup, or whatever, you want somebody perhaps who's got that ta-da kind of quality. yes, they can be very good at leading with their, but that can depend on then how much they can bring the team along with them. It will depend on their other interpersonal skills. They'll naturally assume that position. Whether they then bring people with them is another matter. Yeah, they might give people a lot, they might delegate a lot, they might be very happy to do that, give their subordinates a lot of autonomy, but as long as obviously the job gets done. Then moving into areas that are tipping over into being a bit more counterproductive. Yes, maybe they can at first seem quite skilled at building a team, but they want to be the absolute centre of it, and that's where things can start to go wrong. If all they're worried about is the attention focusing on them. Similarly, they maybe don't need to have a strict hierarchy, but everybody must acknowledge that they are the one who's in charge, that they are the boss. And that, okay, so we've talked about them maybe being good at being a leader or maybe good at building a team, but then if you take it too far, what we're saying is that this person, the person who's high on bold, wants the team to achieve their goals, not those that have been agreed between individual team members. And that's where, of course, you start to have the problem. And just to show, and it'd be interesting to see how you react to some of these quotes. So these are a mixture of quotes that come from real people that we at PCL have fed back to, who are high on bold. Okay, now I'm not high on bold, so some of these almost take my breath away. So let's see what you think, okay? I think I am a bit of a unicorn. People don't expect someone who looks like me to also be so intelligent. You remember in one of the earlier slides, we did talk about a feeling of superiority around beauty as well as ability. I didn't get the job. It was obvious to both of us that I could do their job better than them. I think they felt too threatened. I didn't feel there was any point going to university. I'm extremely smart, and I wasn't sure there was much they could teach me. Might be a little bit of low learning approach in there too. Unfortunately, a lot of people are intimidated by me. I have to deal with a lot of jealousy. And that was a theme that came out from some of the earlier descriptions. And I've got a couple more. I am the only person in the world who could have done this. I mean, I just can't imagine ever saying that. But that is, again, I think the client will be disappointed if anyone but me delivers this work. They are expecting the big man himself. It was hard for me to choose a career because there are just so many things I could have excelled in. So this is the world of the bold person. This is how they view the world. This is how they view themselves. Or depending on how, obviously there's insecurity underlying that. This is the carapace. This is the skin that they have put on to protect themselves from thinking that sometimes, occasionally, maybe they're not. But it means that they say things like this. And they think it's okay to say things like this. And that they don't understand how other people will respond to that. Particularly, it's all right if it's once in a while. But once, as with all of the derailers, it becomes a consistent pattern of behaviour, then it becomes wearing and disappointing and irritating. And the credibility is lost. So the big thing, I think, then for bold is around the coaching process or the feedback process or the developmental process. How can we help or guide the person who's high on bold to take some of these characteristics and use them perhaps more productively? So number one is to think about the focus of coaching then for somebody who's high on bold. We know that these people, they see themselves as super special, super entitled, Superman or Wonder Woman, and they want that recognition for those special qualities. So really And that obviously that can rub people up the wrong way and really irritate them and antagonize them. But if in sort of trying to feed back or work with them developmentally or coaching them, if you were to go in and challenge that underlying assumption, then that's probably not a good place to start, because that just rattles their cage. It just really, will shock them. It's an underlying belief that they have to kind of hold on to in order to feel effective. So instead of doing that, what you want to try to do, just in general, is to try to reduce the impact of some of these derailing tendencies, or turn them into something that's more productive, turn them into something that's going to engage other people more with them so that they can bring people along with them. And you can play to their desire, the bold person's desire, to be seen positively and as special by saying, but if you do these things, then people will perceive you as the brilliant leader that you are, and so on, or something like that. So you've got to, it has to be comfortable for them. They have to see a benefit for them in terms of doing the work. So there are some examples here of some thought-provoking questions you could ask them. And these are from the book that I have referenced for you before, the Coaching on the Dark Side book. So some examples here. Just to let them to start to think about, what could go wrong? Do I ever do things wrong? Just to plant a few seeds. Maybe you could ask them, well, what might go wrong that's beyond your control? So that's kind of a nice, safe way of not admitting to it being anything that they did, but to start to think about. And it could be about an event that happened. It could be that you're saying what did go wrong that was beyond your control. How can you be successful in a way that brings people with you? That makes sure that you get the support and recognition of your peers and managers. So I think so there's a lot in that. There's a lot of work to do on that one, I would say. How can you leverage your confidence to inspire others most effectively? So rather than using that confidence just to be the great I am and talk about your own accomplishments, how could you use that to really enthuse others and get them on board, get them on side, encourage them, maybe make them feel more confident? How can you drive your agenda in a way that others don't feel too dominated? Because otherwise, if you just go into bold style, you're just going to be bulldozing your path through that. And this could be a bit of a challenge for them. What is the best way that you can show humility, with the suggestion that actually the more effective leaders do show vulnerability from time to time? In fact, their followers actively want to see people admitting to mistakes, admitting to things that have gone wrong, and are likely to be more engaged with them and identify with them more if they do. Another strategy you could use, and I've used this with the previous scales that I talked through, would be to do the crossing the line activity, which is from the Doplich and Cairo book. And I think what's nice about this is that you do show, okay, so when you're in the effective zone, these are the great things about you. But you've got to remember that when you're not managing your social impression as well as usual, you're likely to tip over onto the right-hand side, and really start to get them to think about, well, what happens there? What's the impact they're having when they've gone from being willing to fight for what they believe in to somebody who just is unwilling to give up a fight, no matter what. Nobody can persuade them otherwise. They've decided that this is the right solution and this is the only way we're going to do it. But just, showing them what are the shades of their behaviour, and where is it they're going from, say green on the left to red on the right, and starting to get them to perhaps observe themselves, to diarise, to think, and to really start to monitor their behaviour more. And thinking about, yes, they can sometimes take other people's points of view into account, but when they're in counterproductive mode, only their answer is the right one. They, yes, might sometimes admit to mistakes, but when they're in the effective zone, but when they cross the line, no, they're not going to accept that mistake was anything to do with them. And whether they, are willing and open to interpret and use other people's views, or whether they just want to have everything be aligned with their own point of view. But showing them the kind of the two buckets, the two extremes of these are things that you do well and that have a positive impact on your colleagues, but when you tip over into this style, then that's where it starts to become counterproductive. I think can be a use, because you're trying to get them to just gradually open up to the possibility that some of these styles of behaviour can actually have a negative impact on people they work with. Also, a few examples of some exercises here that you could maybe do with people who are high on bold in a coaching context. And this addresses the point around playing to their strengths a bit and saying, yes, okay, so you've got these areas of confidence and optimism, and all of that can be very useful and purposeful, but to actually strengthen that, to take that and to use it in an even more productive way to your own and others' advantage more, maybe actually developing a more realistic sense of your own shortcomings could be helpful. So you could, for instance, maybe write a list of, think about, well, what's not totally great about me? We're not saying what's dreadful. What's not totally great about you? Give me some ideas here. Or you could try to think about how others see somebody who knows you well, maybe a very long-standing colleague or a partner. Ask them, or think about, what would they say are your weaker areas? What would they say isn't totally great about you? Trying to just gently, one step at a time, get them to open up. Another exercise you could do, though, is to think about and monitor your feelings to criticism, because the bold person typically might look like they're taking criticism really well, and that negative feedback, they might look, because they are robust and they're not necessarily going to get upset about it, but the problem is, are they actually taking it and doing anything with it? And chances are that they're not. So think about, try to encourage them to think about their feelings when they're being criticised. Or could they even reframe it as, this is a constructive piece of advice for me. I shouldn't be taking that so personally or feeling it as an attack on my capabilities. And finally, maybe, ask people who you work with a question. Don't just say, I think we should do this, or why don't we do it? And don't make the question about you. Don't say, what did you think about my speech today? What did you think of my idea? Ask them a question, something about them. Maybe, what idea have you got? Might be nice. So those are some ideas, just planting some seeds of some questions you could ask in a coaching context. And then finally, some ideas for coaching strategies as well that you could use. So thinking about, and these are quite detailed and quite specific, and I think if you've got somebody who really is struggling in this area, so I think some of these very specific ideas and specific strategies could really help. So ask them to think about, well, what's the resistance that I am going to get from other, I've got this idea, or I think this project should go this way, I think this should happen. Just get them to stop and think about, okay, well, what might be some of the pushback on that? What do you think people are going to say? What are they going to say isn't going to work? And start to think about how you answer that. But think about how you might answer it in terms of, but what is in it for you? So how could we work on this together then? You see it like this, I see it like this. Where's the middle ground here? Where could we mutually benefit from this? So that's one idea. Another is to list 2 or 3 ways that they can best fulfill their role as a leader for the team, and to think about the success of the team. Shift the focus from their own personal success to, okay, what are some actual actions I could take, ways that I could talk with my team, things that I could ask them to do, things I could involve them in, that will set them up for success, not just me. The humility piece. So maybe having a full and frank discussion around the vulnerabilities piece, and how actually it's likely to make them be more appreciated as a leader. It's not necessarily a sign of weakness. And maybe get the leader to rehearse how are they going to give recognition to others if things go well. Not just about thinking how are they going to bask in their own glory, but how could they actually give positive feedback and recognise the contributions of others. And finally, to think about and really get them to consider where something did go wrong, and to review it and to look back on it and to think, what could I have done differently to have ensured success? And don't let them wriggle out of it actually having gone wrong. And that is the thing with somebody who's high on bold, feeding back and asking them to say something that didn't go to plan. They often turn it around to a positive ending that they were the ones, the masterminds of. So it's, trying to keep them in that zone. And so this was a question that one of our consultants asked somebody who was high on bold. What do you think you'll like to work with? To which they responded, I've never thought about that question. And then on reflection thought that maybe I'm not that great to work with actually after all. Because they don't, they're just so blinkered, they're in their own heads, in their own world, believing in their own talents and abilities, and not considering how are they impacting other people at work. So to wrap up then on bold, we've introduced maybe a few little extra images, like the worker bees and the red carpet and things like that, and poise. But we've also started to think about, okay, but the big thing here is working with these people. How do we guide them to really leveraging what they've got in a much more positive way? So the overall focus then of any development or coaching work with the bold person is going to be really trying to help them to understand the impact that they have on others. Finding ways to leverage those effective level behaviours that they are so fond of. Obviously, they've been reasons for their success so far. They don't want to just relinquish them. They will want to be able to tap into those. But as a coach or as somebody giving feedback, our job is to try to give them ways and strategies of keeping them in the effective zone more. Making sure that they have strategies for appreciating, recognising, involving others more, and maybe demonstrating a bit of humility from time to time. And then these are the books that I have referenced, and that all of this, apart from the quotes and the actual sort of consultant work that we've done, in essence comes from The New Personality Self-Portrait, Alderman Morris, Personality Disorders in Modern Life, Theodore Millon, and Coaching the Dark Side of Personality, Warren Feltz and Kellett.